Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Collaborative Science for Estuaries webinar series. My name is Nick Soberall. I'm a member of the NERRs Science Collaborative staff. We're glad that you can join us today for this webinar titled Exploring Applications of Ecosystem Service Conceptual Models for Coastal Habitats with Lydia, Olander, and Sara Mason. In this webinar, Lydia and Sara will focus on their work with the North Carolina and Rookery Bay NERRs to develop models of oyster, reef, and mangrove ecosystem services, efforts to apply these models to specific restoration sites at these reserves, and use of the models as a way to think about standardized monitoring of ecosystem services outcomes across the NERRs network. The webinar today is part of a monthly webinar series that features research, integrated assessment, and science transfer projects funded by the NERRs Science Collaborative. Some webinars also feature the work of Science Collaborative team members as they engage the reserve system. Please join us for our next webinar on Thursday, July 18th from 3 to 4 p.m. with Dr. Matt McCarthy and Dr. Britta Jessen. Their webinar is titled Mapping the Effects of Long-Term Hydrologic Stress, Sea Level Rise, and Hurricane Irma on Coastal Habitats in Southwest Florida, and will feature their work using advanced satellite imagery to map the damage, death, and recovery of mangroves with a time series of images from 2010 to 2018. We'll be taking a break for the month of August, but please mark your calendars for our September panel discussion on climate adaptation. That webinar is on Monday, September 9th, 2019 at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, and will feature a discussion among 4 project leads that have been testing different approaches for helping communities anticipate and prepare for climate impacts. The discussion will focus on lessons learned and the potential for applying their approaches in new situations and places. You can register for both of these webinars on our Collaborative Science for Estuaries webinar page. Before we get started, I'd like to ask a couple of poll questions to get a sense for who is part of today's webinar and your familiarity with the NERRs and Science Collaborative. Please respond when you see the poll at your screen. Looks like we've got quite a bit of participation for people who either partner with the NERRs or have at least heard of the NERRs, so glad that you can join us today. And we just have one more poll question before we continue with the formal presentation, so we'll go ahead and launch that one now. Okay, we have a fair amount of government participation, so welcome to everybody. Okay, we'll move on with the presentation. So, some quick background for those who are new to the NERRs and the Science Collaborative. The National Estuarine Research Reserve System, or NERRs, is a network of 29 unique research reserves as shown on the map in front of you. This is a NOAA program that works in collaboration with a local place-based partner, either a state agency, university, or nonprofit. Each reserve is protected for long-term research, water quality monitoring, education, and coastal stewardship. Their mission is to practice and promote stewardship of coasts and estuaries through innovative research, education, and training using a place-based system of protected areas. NERRs Science Collaborative is one of the research funding mechanisms for the NERRs. It's currently housed at the University of Michigan through a cooperative agreement with NOAA. The research it supports is distinctive in a few ways. The project supports reserve management needs through highly collaborative research, integrating the end users of the research into the research process itself to produce outcome-oriented products, with the goal being research uptake and use. We emphasize engagement through our webinars, and we want to hear your thoughts and questions. You can send your questions at any time via the questions box, and the speakers will answer them during a question and answer period at the end. If you have any technical questions or concerns about the webinar or webinar platform, you can feel free to message us in the chat, and we will also answer those throughout the presentation. With that, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. Dr. Lydia Olander directs the Ecosystem Services Program at the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions at Duke University. She leads the National Ecosystem Services Partnership, supporting efforts to integrate ecosystem services into decision-making, and studies environmental markets and mitigation, including forestry and agricultural-based climate mitigation, wetland, stream, and endangered species mitigation, and water quality trading. Sara Mason joined the Ecosystem Services Program at the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions as a policy associate after graduating from Duke with a master's degree in environmental management. Her work focuses on the interdisciplinary nature of biodiversity conservation and how that can be leveraged to engage the public and policymakers in conservation efforts. Prior to joining the Nicholas Institute, Sara worked in ecological field research and endangered animal rehabilitation. Since 2016, Lydia and Sara have been working with the NERRs to think about how to incorporate ecosystem services more intentionally and systematically into coastal decision-making and management, resulting in 2 publications on the use of the Ecosystem Service Conceptual Model framework in the NERR context that laid the groundwork for the current project. So with that, we'll pass control over to Lydia. Okay, Lydia and Sara, the floor is yours.
All right. We're just getting the slides up. Can you see our presentation?
Yes, we can.
Great. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you very much for having us on the webinar today, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. We just want to note that throughout the presentation, we're going to ask for feedback in a few different places. And the purpose is really, we're just in the process now of starting to figure out what products we're going to create from this project. We have some ideas, and we'd love to get some feedback on what's going to be most useful for the NERRs and their partners. And so we're going to get a sense from all of you what you think about that. But to start off, we have a poll question just to kind of know where everyone is about how familiar you are with ecosystem services. So if we could do that poll real quickly. Hi, Nick. We can't see the results because we're presenting, so if you can just tell us generally what they are once you start seeing them.
I'll go ahead and post them right now. Looks like people are just about wrapping up with voting. Oh, yeah, a couple more coming in. And I'll go ahead and share those. Okay. Do you see the poll results now, or are they still invisible to you?
I think they're invisible to us, so if you could just summarize.
Yeah, because we're presenting, we can't see them.
No problem. 31% say I use ES concepts all the time and or have done assessments. 40% say I am familiar with ecosystem services. 26% say I know something about ecosystem services but don't use these concepts often. And 3% say I am new to ecosystem services.
Great. Thank you very much. So I'll just give a very brief introduction since most people seem familiar, and you'll definitely get a deeper sense as we go through our presentation anyway. But ecosystem services are the benefits that nature provides to people. And this goes beyond what we currently or usually think about in terms of ecological outcomes and things that nature does, all the way to how it affects people. So we want to think about kind of effects on human well-being that come from nature. So that's really what we're going to be talking about today. So I'm going to give a little bit of background on where we're coming from and how all of this fits together. So the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions, where we work, is developed to link academic knowledge and decision makers to solve environmental challenges. And our program is the Ecosystem Services Program, where we work with, think about private and public decision making and trying to improve methods, incentives, and markets. And part of this is the National Ecosystem Services Partnership, which has been around for about a decade now. And we've been engaging both public and private individuals and organizations to enhance collaboration within the ecosystem services community and to strengthen coordination of policy, market implementation, and research at the national level. The partnership has a community of practice, which anyone is welcome to join. It's an email list. We have about 1,500 people on the list right now. We have a quarterly newsletter we send out to this group. We also host a series of webinars ourselves. We have an online guidebook on ecosystem services for federal agencies that also includes a resources page that we update regularly with all kinds of things from ourselves, but also from lots of other organizations that we think will be of value to people doing ecosystem services work. We have been doing a variety of work on best practices guidance to try to kind of further ideas for how to implement ecosystem services. And we have a engaged expert network from all of the various work that we've done that we can help connect people to. So the goals of this partnership have been to create a national network for sharing ecosystem services information, to establish pathways for implementation of ecosystem services concepts, to really help bridge from that concept of what ecosystem services are to the practice of putting this into decision making, and to create some frameworks that can help standardize and make ecosystem services more intuitive and make sure that they're credible as they get incorporated into decision making and implementation. So we're going to talk about one of the frameworks we've been using a lot today. Is Ecosystem Services Conceptual Models is what we call them. And so we are, at this point, working on and testing these models through the National Ecosystem Services Partnership in a variety of different ways. And these models are ways to easily organize and share information regarding ecosystem services that are specific to a particular habitat or ecosystem or to a particular type of management approach. And they're a way that is very intuitive and can be used consistently. So we think it's a useful tool. In a little bit more detail, we want to just talk about what these models include and incorporate. So looking at the model on the top, we're just showing how a conservation strategy or management action moves through a system. So it results in some environmental change, physical changes to a system, and that has an effect on ecosystem services. So it affects the production of nature's benefits that affect people, and that has a change in human well-being. And so that can be a positive or a negative change. And then sometimes these conservation strategies or interventions also have a direct change on people. So that can be creation of jobs or educational programs or other things. So these kind of conceptual models can include both of these kinds of changes. And the model, the string at the bottom or the pathway at the bottom goes into a little bit more of the kind of detail of how we are breaking these apart in the models that we're developing these days. So we have the intervention in purple on the left, which has a set of biophysical changes. These can be multiple changes that it goes through in this pathway. And these result in some kind of ecological change in the green box. And then there's human activities that change as a result of this. That's the blue box. And then that has an effect on human well-being, which is socioeconomic changes. And then we're trying to develop metrics for that final point, these socioeconomic changes or changes in human well-being. So we'll talk a little bit about metrics for those. So the ecosystem services are that connection between the ecology and the socioeconomic changes. And so we break it apart like this in part because people are measuring and monitoring each of these steps along the way. So there are metrics for ecological change that people are developing, metrics sometimes for human activity changes, and then what we're trying to develop are the metrics for the socioeconomic changes or the human well-being changes on the end. So this helps break apart those various different aspects. This is just an example of that for a project we're doing right now on oysters. And so there's the oyster reef restoration or creation at the beginning that has a change on the oyster reef quantity or quality, which affects the fish populations that surround that reef and use that reef. And this affects recreational fishing for fish species that tend to be associated with these reefs. And that affects jobs in recreation. So the greater recreation around those reefs and perhaps increase in jobs. And then the metric for that is the number of recreational jobs that resulted from oyster reef restoration. So this is an example of how these models work for us. So what can we do with these models? We think they're have a lot of different benefits and uses, and our experience so far with agencies suggests that they are a useful tool. So I'm just going to walk through some of the different ways we think they're useful. So first, these kind of generic models can be adapted to different contexts, and so they can be adapted to different types of management and different ecosystems and different decision contexts relatively easily by anyone who's using them. Second, they're useful kind of a systems thinking tool that helps bring stakeholders and experts together, as well as it's very transparent and logical kind of models. And so it takes people beyond the ecological outcomes to really connect it to the impacts to people and what people care about, and helps to incorporate non-target outcomes, as well as the target ones we're aiming for, our goals. It includes co-benefits and unintended consequences as well, so that can be useful. It also, in this process of linking to people, can help us think about what, not only what services we're providing, but who's benefiting or affected by these things. So we want to understand what groups will be affected by these changes in ecosystems, and this may help us broaden the audience of who might be interested in these projects if we can explain better how these management activities impact people's lives, their interests, and their environment. And it helps us start thinking about perhaps new partners or expertise that can be brought into projects. The other thing these models help with is consistency. Ecosystem services tend to be very context specific because they are unique to a specific community, group, stakeholder, or ecosystem. But there's still a need for consistency in how they are considered across contexts so that comparisons can be made. So using consistent ecosystem services conceptual models can allow for comparison of proposed projects across different project or management types, across different locations. It can also allow us to kind of roll up outcomes across different projects or locations so that we can understand how things are working at a larger scale. So if we have common services and metrics that we're accounting for across these sites, there's a lot of value we can get. Next site. So this leads into the metric selection. So if we have consistency in these models and use them to develop a common set of socio-ecologic metrics or indicators and use those for monitoring, then we can do this cross comparison and roll up much more easily across sites, and this consistent monitoring can be a real value. And another thing we can do is develop evidence libraries or kind of literature reviews that are tied to the Ecosystem Services Conceptual Models, so that becomes a framework for this evidence review. And this allows us to understand where the gaps are in our knowledge of the connection between an ecological change and the effects on people. And that'll help us understand where research needs to be, but also where our monitoring needs to be. And so we can develop these evidence libraries and develop kind of a strength of evidence map to understand what we know and what we don't know. That also can feed into this selection of metrics of where do we need to monitor, what metrics are important. And then finally, these frameworks also provide a foundation for quantification and valuation. The network model going all the way to what people care about is exactly what economists need to do valuation. It provides a platform for thinking through that clearly and transparently so we get good valuation. They also can be useful for developing quantitative predictive models. So anyone who's familiar with Bayesian network models, this kind of network is the foundation for those kinds of models, and it helps build out the logic of the connections in those models and can be useful in that way. So Over the past few years, NESP has been focused on implementation and working directly with agencies to test ecosystem services ideas and put them into practice. And we started a conversation with NOAA, and they pointed us to the NERRs site as a great place to start testing some of this work. And the reason is that NERRs, being an existing network that already thinks about standardization across their reserves, they also, in their recent strategic plan, called for an increased focus on ecosystem services. And there's also a growing interest and momentum in the reserve system for socioeconomic metrics and monitoring. So we're a really good fit for the kinds of things we're working on. And we have a vision or a proposal for what we think we can build. And just going to walk through that. We are hoping that we can develop a new resource or set of resources for the NERRs based on the major habitats that they manage, so salt marsh, oyster reefs, seagrass, etc. And we want to develop a set of evidence-based ecosystem services conceptual models that have an associated set of suggested social and economic metrics that can be adapted and specified to local contexts. And so the idea here is that if we have this kind of consistent framework to build from, it'll make it more efficient and easier, as well as allow for that cross-comparison and roll-up that might be valuable to the NERRs network. And we also think that these resources might be valuable to the partners that NERRs work with in all of their restoration and work at their sites. So I'm just going to quickly tick through the types of resources we're creating, just to give you a little background. So from these, we're starting with these general evidence-based conceptual models that then can be specified or adapted to specific contexts and locations. And from there, we can develop a recommended kind of common set of socioeconomic metrics that could be used consistently across sites, and potentially evidence libraries that go along with these evidence-based conceptual models that can help us with research gaps and monitoring priorities. And then we could also look at who are the affected communities from these management actions. So do an beneficiaries assessment to understand who are the winners and losers, and think about the equity questions around the different management or restoration activities that might be happening. And then finally, we're working on some facilitation materials so that others can potentially apply these same approaches and resources in other sites. We're hoping to develop a training module on these materials and some case studies as well that will help. All of that could potentially help with rollout and distribution across the reserve network. So just very briefly, I'm going to talk about a little of the other pieces that are related to the project we're going to talk about today. So in our first year building up to this work, we did a test, and we used salt marsh restoration as our test to build out a general conceptual model and then see how well it adapted and specified to different sites. So we looked at the New Hampshire Great Bay and the California San Francisco Bay and applied this general model and said, how well could we adapt it for other sites, and how well would that work? And it worked quite well. There were some variations, but very easy adaptations of the general model. And we also built an evidence library, and so we could identify the research gaps, and we have those that evidence kind of assessment all completed and available in some of our publications that have been shared. We also built a quantitative Bayesian network model off of this network model and tried to see how well that could be adapted to quantification models. And then we asked ourselves, how could we scale this work and test it across more habitats and integrate it more with the NERRs network and generate momentum around it? And that has led to two projects. One is the one we're talking about today with the NERRs, but also another one in the Gulf of Mexico, working with the National Academy's Gulf Research Program. And this project is called the Gulf of Mexico Ecosystem Services Logic Models and Socioeconomic Indicators Project, or GEMS. And the purpose here is there's no common assessment or reporting system for socioeconomic outcomes of the major restoration efforts happening across the Gulf. They have some monitoring efforts in place around biophysical and ecological outcomes, but nothing yet on the socioeconomic outcomes. This makes it difficult to report on things like the Restore Council restoration goals related to community resilience and economic revitalization. therefore, we have our project using ecosystem conceptual models to try to address this. So we're developing a set of common conceptual models that follow through to these social and economic outcomes, and from there are developing a common set of socioeconomic metrics that can be relevant across contexts and hopefully facilitate planning, evaluation, and comparison. And the idea is that we will have kind of guides that will help funders and project planners to compare restoration approaches across a broader suite of shared goals, to identify uncertainties and gaps in knowledge about social and economic outcomes, and track performance towards social and economic goals. In the first phase of our project, we did this for oyster reef restoration, so it's very relevant to our North Carolina case that we'll talk about in a moment. And then in our next phase, which is just getting started, we're supposed to do everything else. So every other restoration type that's happening in the Gulf. We won't be able to do them all, but we will definitely add a lot of other habitat types, some gray infrastructure, things like water quality projects around stormwater or hydrologic reconnection. So there'll be a broad set that we're trying to do kind of to add into this effort. And then we're going to move on to talk about this collaborative catalyst project with the NERRs. So this project is continuing to test this idea that ecosystem services conceptual models can be a foundation for integration of ecosystem services into decisions. And we're working with the 2 NERR sites that have been mentioned already to develop additional habitat-based general models and look at associated applications. So we're working with the North Carolina NERR on an oyster reef restoration model and the Rookery Bay NERR in Southwest Florida on a mangrove restoration model. So I'm going to hand this off to Sara to provide more detail on that part.
All right, so I'm going to start off just by giving you a sense of our project approach to let you know what we actually did in this science collaborative project. So we started off by hosting workshops at both of the NERR sites that Lydia just mentioned, so the North Carolina and Rookery Bay NERR. And we did that to develop our habitat-based ecosystem services conceptual models, as well as to brainstorm those socioeconomic metrics that measure those outcomes on the right-hand side of the models. We then refined our models through expert interviews. So the workshops that we did were made up of practitioners and researchers who study and work on the habitats that we were focused on at each NERR site. And to refine and sort of finish out these models, we talked to ecosystem experts who work perhaps in other systems around the country that are similar, and we wanted to just kind of get a gut check of what we created at our workshops to make sure it made sense to other experts as well. We also talked to people who we called social experts. So those are people who are involved in that sort of connection between nature, the environment, and those socioeconomic outcomes. So we talked to people like ecotourism guides, local fishing guides, people involved in the local seafood industry to really capture that nuance and make sure that we were getting all of the details we needed for those connections between the biophysical and ecological outcomes and the social outcomes that matter to people. We then did an assessment of the feasibility and applicability of the metrics that were generated at our workshops, and I'll go into more detail about that later. And we're also in the process of generating education and outreach materials related to the products that we've created. So this is a list of our project outputs. The rest of the presentation today will be presenting each of these in more detail and really discussing how these products might be used or ways in which they could be useful, hopefully, to organizations like yours. And again, like we mentioned at the beginning, we'll actually be polling you throughout the rest of the presentation to get a sense of how useful these products are to you and to your organization, because we really want to know what elements of this project resonate with people so that we can follow up in future work. Just to note, you'll see that evidence libraries are showing gray here because while we didn't actually create them for this particular project, we want to talk about them and see if there's a demand because we're really now set up to create them for mangrove forests and oyster reefs. All right, so to start out, our first project output is this ecosystem services conceptual model workshop process and facilitation guide. So we heard from both of the NERRs that we worked with that the process of hosting and taking part in a workshop to develop these models and to really think about those socioeconomic metrics was a really valuable experience, both for the NERR staff who were involved as well as the partners who were in attendance. Both reserves told us that the model building process was a great way to start thinking more intentionally about ecosystem services at their reserves, and also increased the ability to think about the socio-ecological system more holistically. So this was important, as we've mentioned, for identifying gaps in knowledge about the systems that the NERRs are working in, and also starting to normalize ecosystem services thinking across different stakeholders, as well as thinking very specifically about how different NERR management decisions affect those different stakeholder groups. So we've documented our workshop process in a facilitation guide that would allow any NERR or any non-NERR organization who also works on these similar issues to take one of our draft models and work with a stakeholder group to develop a specified model that fits their site's context. So this brings us to our first poll question, is how likely would you or your organization be to use facilitation techniques to build one of these models in a workshop setting? And again, there is no wrong answer here. If you think it wouldn't be helpful, that's helpful for us to know. So we won't be seeing the results of this poll, and we'll just give you a few moments to take it. All right, looks like we can move on. Most people have answered. So the next output of our project is the actual ecosystem services conceptual models for these habitats that we worked on. So just to quickly go over our model building process, we would come to our workshops with a rough draft of a model just to give people something to bounce ideas off of. We would use the workshop time to edit and improve the draft model, and this takes really a few hours to sort of go back and forth with the different people present at the workshop to make sure we get something that represents what everyone feels is a good representation of the system that they work in. Again, we showed the model to habitat experts for further feedback, and then we also talked to those social experts that I talked about to make sure all of that nuance had been captured regarding the connection between the ecological system and the social system. So that gave us 3 different conceptual models that I'll show you today. The first is the general oyster reef restoration model for North Carolina, and the next one is the general mangrove model for Florida, as well as a specified mangrove model for a particular restoration site in Rookery Bay. So to start us off, this is the general model for oyster reef restoration in North Carolina. It can seem a bit overwhelming when you first take a look at one of these with boxes and arrows going all over the place. And the purpose of today is not for you to read every single box and arrow, but I will say I'm happy to share links to these models if anyone wants to get in touch with me to examine them in more detail. But just sort of more generally, these models really present a nice summary of how an oyster reef restoration project might cause changes to outcomes that affect people in a North Carolina context. Again, like Lydia mentioned when she was introducing these models, you'll see those ecological outcomes in green, human activity outcomes in blue, and socioeconomic outcomes in yellow. And I do want to make a note that this is actually not very different from the oyster reef model that was developed for the GEMS project that we touched on in the Gulf of Mexico. We found them to be quite adaptable between the 2 contexts with relatively minor differences. So here we have the mangrove ecosystem services conceptual model. It has that same structure and actually includes many of the same elements as the oyster reef model, although there are a few changes. And then here you can see a slightly different model. We were able to apply that general mangrove model to a specific restoration site at Rookery Bay called Fruit Farm Creek. And this is the version of the model we came up with. So Fruit Farm Creek is a roughly 225-acre site of dead and dying mangroves that requires reconnection to the surrounding hydrology for restoration. And so that's the context in which we were building this model. And so you can see that parts of the model have been turned off or shown in gray to illustrate those things that are not relevant at this site. So you can just take the general model and just make slight alterations to make it represent whatever site you're working at. We also developed a worksheet that kind of delves into the further specifics about some of the elements in this model, like who would be affected by changes to aesthetics and odor caused by the mangrove die-off, what species of animals and plants might be most affected, and who users of the site might be for those recreational purposes that might be restored with the restoration of the site. So that worksheet will be included in that facilitation guide that I mentioned earlier. And so this brings us to our next poll question, which is how useful would it be for you or your organization to have a set of these models for common coastal habitats? All right, looks like everyone answered. Thanks very much. The next output of our project is those socioeconomic metrics that we talked about. So quickly to tell you how those were generated, at each workshop, we prioritized ecosystem services outcomes from the models. So we took that right-hand side that lists those sort of human activity and socioeconomic outcomes related to habitat restoration, and we prioritized with the workshop groups which ones we wanted to develop metrics for, because we really want to be prioritizing metrics for those outcomes that are dominant. And we defined dominant as metrics that were closely linked or tightly linked to restoration of a particular habitat, and that were also important to people. And so that's how we prioritized. We generated metric ideas in small groups using worksheets that you can see in the middle of this slide. Those are also going to be included in our facilitation guide. And then we would come back together as a group and try to come to an agreement with the full workshop on selected metrics for each ecosystem services outcome that had been prioritized. And then we took all of those metrics that were generated at the workshops, and our team went through a metrics assessment to determine the feasibility and applicability of those metrics. And so you can see here the metric assessment criteria. I will just say as a note, we're not going to share the list of metrics today. You'll be able to find those in our reports for each reserve, which are going to be published near the end of the summer. But you can also feel free to reach out to us and we can share those lists with you. But to get back to the assessment, we really wanted to determine how feasible and how applicable these metrics would be in the NERRs context. And so we applied some criteria to try to whittle down those long lists of metrics and to be able to rank and compare them in some way. And so you can see the criteria listed here. We asked, has the metric been measured elsewhere, and are there actually protocols or methods out there that could be adapted for a NERR site? How easy or difficult is it to get this type of data, and how costly is it? Does the suggested metric actually capture the ecosystem services outcome of interest, or is it more of a proxy? Can you actually attribute changes in the metric to a particular restoration project going on? or some management decision made by the NERR. So this one turned out to be really important, especially if you're doing a project assessment. And this is one that is pretty difficult to attain. There's lots of attribution issues that we ran into. The next criteria was how fast might you expect to see changes in metric measurements? So would you actually be able to see changes in a particular metric during a typical project lifecycle? And finally, would data on this metric actually resonate with different types of stakeholders? So one of the important aspects of socioeconomic monitoring of ecosystem services projects is that you can produce data that might resonate or connect with a broader audience than those who might typically be interested in science or the environment. So you can start to produce data that shows people how these environments are affecting their lives and the things that they care about. And so we're working on assessing the outputs of this metric ranking and comparing the outputs to some of the metric assessment that we did for that Gulf GEMS project that we talked about. And so I'm going to talk about that comparison really quickly because I think the outputs of that are applicable to this project as well. So the Gulf project that we brought up earlier really pushed to get to those socioeconomic metrics, while the metrics generated at our science collaborative workshops were often human activity metrics, so kind of one step back from a socioeconomic measure. And this is probably, we think, because for the projects that the NERRs and their partners are engaged in, they're really focused on the effects that occur at the project level. And what we found for the GEMS project was that if you're pushing all the way to socioeconomic metrics, you often have to think about metrics in a matrix like this that's shown on the screen, because there really are some socioeconomic outcomes that can't really be tracked at a project level. And instead, they have to be tracked at a larger scale. So you can see at the bottom there, we have metrics that we suggest to be measured at the county scale. So you can see here for the Gulf project, we've split the metrics in two ways. First, by whether we recommend that all projects measure them or whether it's feasible for all projects to measure. And second, by what scale the data could be collected at. So is it being measured at the project scale or at the county scale? And you can see some examples listed here of the types of metrics falling in each category. You know, some of these metrics measured at the project level, you know, can be measured relatively easily by going out and doing a certain survey or just by getting data directly from the project, so you can count the number of jobs that it creates in the restoration industry, or you can go out to the project site and count the number of recreational fishermen using the site. But some of those larger scale metrics require additional surveys or modeling efforts to actually get that data. And so we have some recommendations for how that might be done that we'll be releasing later this summer. So again, you'll be able to see our final list of suggested metrics in our report materials that will be up on the Science Collaborative website, and we'll incorporate a comparison to those metrics developed for this Gulf project. So we have another poll question to ask you about these metrics. How useful would it be for you or your organization to have a standardized set of socioeconomic metrics and a suggested approach for measuring them? All right, so I mentioned that we're also creating education and outreach materials related to this project. We have some simplified models for communications purposes. So we talked to both of the NERR sites that we're working with, and it sounded like while these, you know, the complicated box and arrow diagrams that are sort of complex models are great for thinking systematically with, you know, researchers and practitioners, the general public or other stakeholders aren't going to want to see something quite so complicated. So you can see here that we've kind of whittled down our models to just the essence and created some simplified models for communications purposes. We're also creating some infographics, some ecosystem services educational content and activities for middle school audiences, as well as an adaptable PowerPoint that describes ecosystem services of these habitats to different stakeholder groups. So when we were talking to the different NERRs, and especially the communications people at each site, we found that the reserves were already doing ecosystem services related outreach, even if they don't necessarily use that term, ecosystem services. But we're trying to see if we could make education and outreach material using the models as a starting point. And so that's sort of the differentiation that we see in some of the content that we're creating. So I have another poll question for you. Would additional incorporation of ecosystem services content into generalized outreach or education materials be useful to you or your organization? All right, so the last product that we wanted to introduce is something we've mentioned a couple times, is these evidence libraries. So we didn't make them for this project, but we have made them before and wanted to just quickly discuss how they relate to these conceptual models and how we think they're useful. So you can see on the slide everything that an evidence library entry includes. So each arrow in this diagram, we've actually pulled out and written up a description of that relationship. So each arrow represents a relationship between two different elements of the system. We've written up a summary of that evidence, confidence in the assumption of that relationship given the evidence that we found, a list of other factors that might affect that relationship that the arrow describes, as well as a list of the sources that we used. And so all of these entries are then compiled into a document that accompanies our models and can be referenced to examine what's known about a particular linkage and how strong that evidence is. And so really quickly, just so you can get a sense of what this looks like, I'm going to go to one of our documents. And I think Nick actually shared a link to this, so if anybody wants to look in more detail later, they're welcome to do so. But you can see here we kind of have a table of contents listing where you can find information on each link. And like I said, we have sort of a write-up for each arrow that describes the relationship that it's representing, presenting a summary of sort of the major pieces of evidence that we found, listing those other factors that might affect that relationship, and then actually giving a strength of evidence score that ranges from high strength of evidence all the way down to moderate, fair, low, and no evidence. And so, this goes on for 90 or so pages describing each of those different relationships in our model. We've heard from people that because no one is ever going to be an expert in all of those different topic areas, these summaries can really be a starting point for understanding how everything fits together and act as a reference resource. And I mentioned that we give a strength of evidence score to each of the different links in the model, and what that can do for you is actually allow you to create what we call a strength of evidence map. And so once you have that confidence score or that evidence score, you can create a visual representation of where we have good evidence and where evidence for a particular system might be lacking. And you can kind of see how it all fits together in a diagram like this one.
And so for those that can't see very well, the greens are higher and the purple is lower. Just so you can see that.
Yeah, I can't see it. Anyway, you're welcome to peruse this later. So that brings us to our final poll question of the day. Would a generalized evidence library for common coastal habitats be useful to you or your organization?
So just real quickly, wanted to talk about next steps for this work. So we're trying to present some of this work at the NERRA meeting in 2019 to get some additional feedback and share what we've done and see if there's more interest across the NERRs reserves. Then we also want to build some training materials. So we're talking about building a module for an ecosystem services training that's just being developed by NOAA. And there are conversations underway, and we hope that will start being developed shortly. We also are creating ecosystem services conceptual models for a variety of remaining habitats through the Gulf of Mexico project. So we'll be adding to that list of models that we have. We are also going to be developing additional socioeconomic metrics. So we have the ones from this project, the ones from the GEMS project, and we'll compile those all together. And then as we mentioned, for evidence libraries, we have two, one for salt marsh and we have one for oyster reef restoration. At this point, we're not planning to create additional full libraries, but if that's of value to people, and we'll find out when we see your results, that is something we can consider developing further. But it'd be great to know how to make those most useful to people. And finally, we are in a conversation with the Hawaii NERR about cultural services and trying to further develop examples of cultural services, which seem to be often not considered as much, not as familiar to the NERRs sites, and so having some examples might be valuable. So that conversation is just getting started. So thank you for your attention through all of this. We appreciate your responses to our questions as well. We look forward to looking at the results. And here are the contact information for us and a project page with some background. And we are ready to answer questions.
Great, thanks guys. Just as a quick reminder, you can pose questions via the questions box in the GoToWebinar console. We've got a few here already that I will read to our presenters, but feel free to keep asking additional questions. Generally, if there's an overflow of questions, which does tend to happen with these webinars, given the time frame, we will collect the questions and include them in the webinar brief that we send out about a week or two after the presentation date. So if you do have questions that you want answered, feel free to still put them in the prompt and we will collect them automatically. First question we have here. Somebody towards the beginning, I recall this, I saw this earlier, let me find the exact question. It asked, could the arrow between environmental change and social change be bidirectional? I think that is referring to your diagram up on slide 6, I believe.
Just simply yes. I think there are feedbacks in all pieces of these models. So I'll leave that short and sweet.
Very good. And we had another question that also was posed during the presentation. Somebody had asked they were curious about what software you use to make those model flow diagrams. The very pretty and very complicated looking ones a few slides back.
That's a question we get asked all the time. So we use a program called Lucidchart. And so a lot of universities have licenses for that program, and if you have a .edu email address, you can get an educational upgrade that allows you sort of full access to that program. You can get a free trial version that allows you to make those diagrams but it gives you limited capabilities, so you can only draw a certain number of boxes and arrows, and you run out of drawing elements really quickly. And quickly, I'll just say another free one to try if you find on the internet, draw.io. That's another one that we found. It's not quite as pretty as Lucidchart, but it works pretty well.
The other benefit of Lucidchart is since other people can have, even if they don't purchase it, can use Lucidchart, they can view and play with the models a little bit as well. So it's a good way to share these models.
Great, thank you. We have another question here that appeared towards the end of the presentation. Somebody inquired, how can you mention how present ecosystem services work is informed by changes in the global value of ecosystem services? I think that's referring to an article. They have an author name here, Costanza et al., 1997. I think it's referring to GDP. I think is the question is asking. So can you mention how present ecosystem services work is informed by, I think it's an article, changes in the global value of ecosystem services?
Well, I think if I understand the question correctly, so this work is really about how do we integrate consideration of ecosystem services into management decisions that are happening on the ground. And ideally, if we do that, we will be, rather than degrading our ecosystem services, we were facilitating and enhancing our ecosystem services. So overall, the outcome would hopefully be enhancement of ecosystem services. And other work that's looking at accounting for natural capital at a global scale would ideally be able to capture and account for those kinds of changes over time. But I think there's kind of two different things. One is kind of measuring and accounting for changes in services, and then what we're trying to do, which is how do we integrate these kinds of considerations into decision making. So slightly different things, but definitely connected.
Okay, another question here. Can we explore ways for non-NERRs to benefit from all of your good work? The National Estuary Programs would love access to these tools, I'm sure.
Well, we would love to have other people involved in other programs using this work. We understand that the training we're going to be working on with NOAA is available to other institutions and organizations. We've been to one of their trainings before, and they had a whole bunch of other people that work in the region on other institutions involved in those trainings. So that is definitely one pathway. And all these materials will be available online through us, but also through NOAA's Digital Coast. And if people want have particular questions or issues or want details on applications, we're happy to follow up with people or their organizations directly as well.
Got time for a few more questions here, so I'll see if I can get through them and just make sure we have time to ask as many as possible. Looks like this one's a little bit more of a technical one in terms of your actual research. The question is, in building the salt marsh generalized model, did you consider coastal marshes broadly speaking, e.g. marine and freshwater coastal marshes? How well do you think the generalized model might apply to freshwater, i.e. Great Lakes coastal marshes?
So we were looking at salt marshes for that model. We have thought a little bit about how that might apply to freshwater marshes, so something that would be applicable at the Great Lakes. And I think in the model structure probably wouldn't change that much. You have to work at it with people familiar with the system to make sure that everything you needed was incorporated. What really would change would be that strength of evidence map, as well as the evidence library that goes behind the model. So all of that was put together specifically for coastal systems, for marine systems, and so that would have to be adapted for a freshwater context.
Great, so it looks like we have time for one more question here, so I'll just pose this last question before we adjourn. Is this group developing any large-scale ecosystem models focusing on biological effects, i.e. food chain support, rather than socio-economic?
Sorry, could you repeat that? It was a little fuzzy.
Sure. Is this group developing any large-scale ecosystem models focusing on biological effects? And the example they gave is food chain support.
Okay, so I'll do my best on that one. I think I would say that there is some underlying work associated with the species that are kind of key species identified in these models that may look to some of the kind of food chain models, but we don't delve into very, like, kind of this really, really detailed ecological kind of underpinnings of like the food chain in great detail. I know there are other places and other kind of conceptual models that focus on the ecological side of the system that do more of that than we do. Since we are really focused on the connection to people and the ecosystem services, we try to kind of focus on the ecosystem changes that are most critical to affecting people. And so it is somewhat limited in the ecological details. Hopefully that answers the question.
Excellent. Our time is about up. We ran just over the hour, just trying to make sure we had room for everyone's questions. Just as a quick reminder, you can still pose questions in the console if you think of any. We will leave the session open a bit longer after the end of the actual formal presentation, so if you have any last-minute thoughts, you can type them in there. You can also type them into the exit survey that'll become available at the end of the webinar automatically, and I think it'll also be sent out tomorrow afternoon around the same time. Thank you for everyone that participated in the webinar today. We love seeing this much interest in these models and their applications. Please keep an eye out for future webinar announcements. We have many interesting projects wrapping up over the coming months that will be sharing their findings and lessons learned, and some panel webinars under development that will look across several projects. So as a reminder, next panel webinar is in September 9th. To follow along, you can sign up for webinar announcements as part of the exit survey following the webinar. Please also consider joining us for our upcoming July webinar about mapping the effects of long-term hydrologic stress, sea level rise, and Hurricane Irma on coastal habitats in Southwest Florida. Be sure to check out the Collaborative Science for Estuaries webpage to download new webinar briefs and view webinar recordings as they become available. We will also let you know when new work is available via our program update. So if you haven't subscribed for that, there will be a link for that in the exit survey again. And finally, let's end with a big thank you to Lydia and Sara for taking the time to prepare a thoughtful and wonderful presentation and share some of their findings and for answering our questions. So Lydia and Sara, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.